The air in Charleston that morning was thick, almost viscous, as if the city itself knew a secret it could not whisper. Market cries and carriage wheels clattered against cobblestones, but beneath the noise, there was a silence far more haunting, the silence of forgotten lives. In the heart of the port, in the shadow of warehouses and the grand mansions of men who called themselves civilized, a woman moved through the crowd. Her eyes were wide, reflective, like dark water, revealing a terror no one dared name. She was the most desired female slave ever auctioned in Charleston, yet her story was buried beneath layers of wealth, power, and shame. No ledger, no announcement, no public record preserved what followed. Only whispers among families and the quiet toll of church bells that never stopped at night. And yet, in the homes and orphanages, in seminaries and private estates, there were those who remembered or pretended to forget. The truth was not in the auction block, not in the contracts, not in the hands that groped at her for ownership. It was in what no one saw, in the spaces between the boards of Charleston's oldest homes, in the locked basements, the hidden rooms, the silence of centuries. From the very first moment she arrived, shadows followed. Shadows not cast by the sun, but by human desire, greed, and a system designed to erase identity. This is not a story of liberation. It is a story of secrets, of hidden corruption, of the invisible chains that linger long after chains themselves have rusted away. The auction house stood like a cathedral of commerce, its columns stained with history and hidden suffering. Men in fine coats whispered prices and promises, oblivious to the weight of the human spirit they attempted to buy. She walked down the wooden planks, her feet barely making a sound, though every heartbeat seemed amplified in the hushed anticipation. She was 17, or so they said, but her eyes carried something older, knowledge of storms and hunger and a trauma unspoken. The bidders did not see her soul. They could not comprehend the subtle way she measured them, how she learned their weaknesses with a glance. The air smelled of oak, tobacco, and something fouler, sweat of men accustomed to dominance. Each nod, each signature on the papers of ownership, felt like a nail driven into a coffin that had no bottom. Families watched from the galleries above, the children ignorant of the unspoken rituals that framed their lives. In the orphanages across the city, doors clicked shut on whispered warnings. In the churches, candles flickered in recognition of sins too deep to confess. And in the shadows, unseen and eternal, the ghosts of those who had suffered before her observed, their faces etched into the grain of Charleston's wood, into the stone of its walls. Her destiny was not merely auctioned. It was entangled, stitched into the fabric of a city that thrived on silence. And as she was led away, no one noticed the small, carved symbol on the corner of the block, a mark older than Charleston itself, whispering a warning that no living soul would heed. The mansion she entered was beautiful, a gilded cage. Walls polished to a sheen, drapes heavy with wealth, yet something rotted beneath the surface. In the servants' quarters, behind a false wall, lay a hidden room. The housekeepers spoke of it in hushed tones, as if mentioning it too loudly would summon its past. It smelled of damp wood and long-forgotten tears, and the air carried a weight that pressed against lungs and sanity alike. It was in that room that she first felt the unseen eyes. Not the eyes of her captors, but something older, something patient. The previous occupant had vanished decades before, and though no one spoke of it, the echoes of her screams remained. At night, the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with secrets not meant for human ears. She slept fitfully, dreams invaded by shapes she could not name, by families she had never known, by churches that hid horrors behind the grandeur of sermons. The mansion became a labyrinth, each hallway a psychological trap designed to erode her sense of reality. Objects moved without explanation, whispers threaded through hallways, and the servants' children began to speak of a woman in white, a ghost who demanded they obey laws of silence older than the city itself. Every attempt to escape the room, even for a breath of night air in the garden, met subtle obstacles. Doors that had been open moments before were now barred. A scent of iron lingered, and the wind seemed to carry a message. The past is never gone, and some chains cannot be broken by flesh alone. News of her sale rippled through Charleston's elite circles, though none dared acknowledge the truth aloud. Conversations were polite, measured, and steeped in avoidance. It was as if naming her existence fully would summon a reckoning too terrible to face. Behind closed doors, however, whispers spoke of a curse, of men who had purchased her and found themselves undone by unseen forces. Wealth vanished, marriages collapsed, and heirs died under mysterious circumstances. The city seemed to conspire in silence. Children noticed shadows that did not belong to anyone walking the streets. Windows rattled for no reason, and church bells tolled at midnight when no hand guided their clapper. Families with ties to the slave trade reported strange illnesses, loss of voice, sudden tremors, and waking dreams of a girl who stared at them accusingly. She was young, but her presence carried authority, as though the world itself recognized a power no contract could claim. She did not speak of revenge, yet those who sought to dominate her felt the weight of it. Each whispered insult, each casual touch, each attempt to assert ownership met subtle sabotage. Doors would lock themselves, garments would vanish, letters would arrive with warnings in handwriting no one recognized. Even the clergy could not ignore it. Sermons became heavier, with sudden references to sin and divine justice that seemed strangely specific, though the preacher himself could not remember composing them. In Charleston, the air was alive with tension, a collective understanding that something had arrived that no one could own. Across Charleston, orphanages hid shadows as deep as the mansions themselves. Girls who arrived seeking sanctuary found themselves trapped in routines and rituals designed to erase individuality. Punishments were severe, but the worst terror was the invisible, whispered threats of families who had never been seen, names scratched into walls, objects that moved without cause, and visions of the woman whose story no one could speak. She became a legend among them, even before entering their spaces. Stories told in shivering whispers warned that she could appear in dreams, standing silently in doorways, holding the past in her gaze. Staff dismissed the rumors, claiming imagination, but children knew otherwise. They began to follow unseen rules, avoiding corners where shadows lingered too long, listening for the faintest scrape of wood that might announce her presence. Her arrival at the mansion was noted silently by orphanage directors. They sensed a shift, an energy that could not be tamed by discipline or faith alone. And some whispered, quietly, that she had come for something, justice, perhaps, or the unveiling of secrets that had been buried beneath Charleston's polite society for centuries. Even the churches sent nuns to pray for her, unaware that their prayers were tangled with her presence, strengthening her influence rather than suppressing it. The city seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging that history itself had been waiting for her arrival. Charleston's seminaries were revered as pillars of morality, yet beneath the polished floors and stained glass windows, secrets festered. Ancient texts and coded sermons hinted at rituals disguised as piety. Students whispered of disappearances, of novitiates vanishing without explanation, leaving only faint symbols etched into the walls. The young woman's presence seemed to awaken those buried horrors. Priests and teachers began to notice small anomalies. Books misplaced, chalk markings forming patterns on the floor overnight, faint sobs in empty corridors. She did not need to speak. Her gaze carried accusation, unraveling centuries of obedience and deceit. The students began to see visions in their studies, faces of women whose lives had been erased, lives bound by silence and fear. And slowly, the seminary itself seemed to shift, its walls closing in like a living organism aware of its own sins. The young woman's shadow moved through the hallways at night, intangible yet undeniable, reminding every inhabitant that history never forgets, it only waits. Charleston streets carried a quiet tension. Market vendors noticed shadows moving independently, stray cats following invisible paths, whispers curling through the alleyways like smoke. Townsfolk spoke in half-formed phrases, as though even their speech might summon knowledge too dangerous to acknowledge. Families who had prospered from the slave trade felt inexplicable dread. Windows rattled without wind, doors closed with sudden force, and dreams were invaded by visions of the woman, tracing a path of memory through generations. The young woman became a figure of both fear and fascination, a living mirror of the city's hidden corruption. And yet, No one confronted her directly. There was an unspoken understanding that her gaze exposed truths too volatile to articulate, truths that could shatter the fragile facade of propriety and wealth. Charleston held its breath, caught between history and revelation, as if the city itself were aware that someone had finally arrived to witness its unspoken crimes. Every night, the mansion trembled with echoes of those who had suffered there before. Whispers intertwined with the wind, faint footsteps crossed the floorboards, and doors would open or close without human touch. She slept fitfully, feeling not only her own fear but the residual trauma of the souls trapped in silence for decades. The house seemed to recognize her, and with recognition came obedience. Chairs shifted, candle flames tilted, and objects appeared where she needed them. The spirits of Charleston's forgotten watched her, guiding, testing, revealing pieces of hidden history too potent for the living to handle. She was no longer merely a victim. She was a vessel of truth, a reflection of a system that had thrived on oppression for generations. In the basements and attics of Charleston, she discovered signs of long-forgotten rituals, ceremonial markings, remnants of objects stained with time and secrecy. Families had concealed these acts under the guise of respectability, but the city remembered. She learned the patterns, deciphering symbols that revealed networks of complicity, merchants, clergy, and judges bound by silent oaths, sustaining cycles of power and abuse. Every corridor she traversed, every room she entered, carried echoes of suffering, each step a revelation of the cost of silence. The orphanages trembled as her influence grew. Girls hid under beds, whispering prayers to a presence they could not see. They reported visions of herself, though she had never been there, warning them, guiding them, invoking long-forgotten names and histories. Staff dismissed the children's fears, but objects moved in inexplicable ways. Drawers opened, paintings fell, doors clicked. Charleston's unacknowledged sins seemed to converge in her, a living catalyst for memory and reckoning. Churches became arenas of tension. Priests felt her influence during sermons. The congregation trembled at subtle references to sin and accountability they could not consciously place. Confessions became unnerving, revealing sins previously hidden, exposing networks of corruption under the veneer of faith. Even the highest-ranking clergy were not immune. They whispered in private chambers about her, but their voices trembled, for they knew she saw beyond words, piercing through years of pretense. Every room in the mansion held memory. Paintings that had never aged, clocks that ticked erratically, hidden compartments filled with letters and diaries detailing past abuses. She traced the family's lineage through these artifacts, uncovering the systematic oppression that had extended for decades. The walls themselves seemed to speak, responding to her presence with creaks, sighs, and faint shadows. She was unraveling centuries of secrecy, step by step. Charleston itself seemed alive with unease. Citizens avoided certain streets at night. Vendors whispered of sightings. A girl appearing where none should have been, staring through windows, a spectral observer of deeds unspoken. The city's collective memory, long suppressed, began to stir. Fear and fascination intertwined. Families felt guilt that had no source, memories that had never happened to them but were echoed in their bones. A small carved symbol, the same that had appeared at her auction, revealed itself repeatedly. Hidden corners, basements, even church pews carried the mark. It was a sigil of resistance, of memory, of truth against the erasure imposed by wealth and power. She began to understand it, not as magic, but as a mnemonic of history, a way to preserve truth when no one else would. Families attempted to manipulate, bribe, and intimidate her. Each action failed, subtly undone by forces she barely understood. The weight of centuries of oppression pressed down, yet she moved through it, unbroken, exposing truths in small, deliberate ways. Her presence forced acknowledgement, a confrontation not just with her story, but with Charleston's buried history. Documents discovered in hidden compartments revealed human trafficking networks, secret punishments, and complicit clergy. Orphanages, seminaries, and wealthy homes were linked by silent codes. Each revelation deepened the horror but clarified the purpose of her journey. She was a witness to history itself. Charleston could no longer ignore her. Shadows and whispers became awareness. Citizens began seeing patterns, remembering things they had tried to forget. The city's silence began to fracture. She became a symbol, unspoken but undeniable, a reminder that no secret can survive when confronted with courage and clarity. In the mansion's hidden room, she revealed the ultimate truth: names, deeds, and abuses meticulously recorded and traced. Families could no longer hide. The city trembled as the weight of acknowledgement pressed upon its people. Her presence forced reckoning, and though some resisted, the truth would no longer be buried. The young woman vanished one night, leaving the mansion empty but forever changed. Shadows no longer hid. Orphans whispered her name in reverence. Charleston remembered. She had become a guardian of truth, a living witness to centuries of hidden corruption. Her story, once impossible to tell, became legend, not in ledger books or public records, but in memory, symbol, and warning. Some truths will always find a way to surface, no matter how deeply they are buried.